Welcome to this session. People are still gradually entering the room, but I think we can start with our introduction. People will continue to enter as I continue. A warm welcome to all of you. I think good afternoon to most of you, maybe good morning to some of you. Welcome to this third keynote lecture of the EAHMH 21 Conference on Faith, Medicine and Religion. A warm welcome to all conference participants and a warm welcome to all of you joining from elsewhere, as these keynote lectures have also been opened to a wider audience. I would also like to mention that the session will be recorded with permission of our speaker. Thank you for that, and will be placed on the KU Leuven Health Humanities playlist on YouTube afterwards. It's my great pleasure. I should introduce myself first. Sorry, my name is Joris van den Driessen. I'm a medical historian at the University of Leuven, and I'm also part of the local organizing committee, and I will be chairing this session. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker of this evening, this late afternoon to you, and that is Professor Tine van Osselaar. She's a research professor at the Ruysbroek Institute of the University of Antwerp. And her work engages with the history of religion, mysticism and spirituality in a very broad sense. She explores the relation of these topics with the history of the body, family and gender, and indeed also in relation to the history of science and medicine. Professor van Osselaar has published widely on these topics, and I won't discuss her entire publication list. That would take much too long, but I just want to highlight two publications to you. An edited volume dating from 2017 that she worked on with Kaat Wils and Henk de Smale, titled Sign or Symptom, Exceptional Corporeal Phenomena in Religion and Medicine since the 19th and the 20th century, or in the 19th and 20th century, published with Leuven University Press. And the second one is a key product of a research project on stigmatics in Europe, which was funded with an ERC starting grant, and which has resulted in an open access book published with Brill in 2020, so just last year, titled The Devotion and Promotion of Stigmatics in Europe between 1800 and 1950, between Saints and Celebrities. We conducted an interview with Professor van Osselaar, like with all keynote speakers, that you may find on the conference website. And in that interview, she presented herself as an historian of religion, studying pain and bodily experience. An historian of religion for whom, and I'm quoting Professor van Osselaar, there is really no way to ignore the medical side of the cases that I study. And Professor van Osselaar, Tine, we were very happy that you accepted our invitation to act as a keynote speaker at this conference in the history of medicine and health. We look forward very much to hearing more about religious experiences and about that medical side you were talking about as well. Please go ahead, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Joris. Thank you for these kind words. I've never been on anyone's playlist, so this is a first to me. But first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a privilege, but I would like to thank Joris for chairing this session, but also calming my nerves because I was very nervous before. After listening to so many wonderful papers in the previous days, I feel a little out of place. But if you're curious about the patient and Catholic devotional culture, I'm happy to give you kind of a very short tour of the fields. So I'm going to share my screen if all goes well. I don't see it yet, so I'm guessing you don't either.
You seem to be at the end of the presentation, didn't it? So you have to go back to start it at the beginning of the
Okay.
the presentation. So maybe share again, and then in the PowerPoint, go back to the beginning slide, it seems.
So this should be better.
Yes. Yeah, now we still see the black slides ending the presentation.
Yeah, I'm just going to kind of just close your eyes. Okay, yeah, I'm sorry because I always saw the starting screen. So my apologies for this, but I hope if this is the only thing that goes wrong, then we're good. So I would like to start this presentation with this picture. It's a picture of the imitation Lourdes Grotto of Oostakker, which is a Belgian pilgrimage site near Ghent. It's an image created around 1875, and at first glance, there seems to be no soul inside. And if you were wondering, the kneeling figure in the left corner is a statue. It's a statue of Bernadette Soubirous, the visionary of Lourdes. So I believe the Catholic faithful are omnipresent in this picture, and I will show you where I see them. So first thing you need to know, however, is that numerous miraculous cures and conversions have been reported at this Marian shrine. It was, and still is, a place where devotees turn to Mary and ask for her help. So the rosaries you see hanging on the wall of the grotto are the rosaries the faithful prayed with near the bedside of a loved one and left at Oostakker as a thank you for a cure or a favor obtained. And the strange pyramid constructions on top of the grotto hold wax imitations of bodily limbs and represent the faithful's hope to be healed or gratitude for being healed. And the crutches you see leaning against the wall and the wheelchair next to it were left there as a symbol or proof, if you like, of a miraculous cure. The former owners no longer needed them to be able to walk. Mary had listened and helped. So these objects are the material signpost of the power of the site. So what I see when I look at this picture are objects that are meant to represent the faithful and the faith they put in Mary. So in the case of the imitation limbs and the crutches, I think we can even say that there is only one part of the faithful's identity they mean to represent. They are the sick or the injured, and that is, apart from their trust in Mary, the only thing that is of relevance here. So I focus on the Oostakker side, which you could easily do the same exercise by looking at, for instance, other pilgrimage sites, as you can see here. So the connotations are somewhat different when I look at this crutch. This is a crutch of Anna Katharina Emmerick, a German mystic of the early 19th century. And the crutch has been carefully preserved by her friends after her death. The crutch has been on display since the late 19th century in the German hometown of Emmerick in Dülmen. And the collection was created on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Emmerick's death in the 1870s and was meant to give a new impulse to the campaign to have Emmerick beatified. So the collection moved several times after it was first shown, but we have a very good idea of what it included and what it looked like when it was put on display at the various locations, thanks to the plans, the floor plans, the descriptions, and the catalog that have been preserved. Now, the objects on display at the various locations were meant, and they still actually are on display because the picture that you see here is a photo taken at the Emmerick Gedenkstätte in Dülmen. So the objects on display were meant to show different aspects of the mystic. Emmerick's humble background, her pious nature, the stigmata, care for her community, but also her poor health, symbolized by this crutch, but also by the bed in which she spent her days. So these crutches, or rather the Catholic sick and the injured whom they are to represent, is what I'm interested in this evening. I want to explore those instances within Catholic devotional culture when the Catholic faithful presented themselves or were presented explicitly as patients and their reasons for doing so. So for instance, I think that the crutches at these two locations I showed have different meaning. In both cases, the crutches are emotionally loaded objects, but whilst they evoke the patient at both locations, they narrate quite different Catholic stories of illness and injury. The crutch in Emmerick's case fits a narrative of resignation to God's will and heroic suffering. The crutches at the pilgrimage site tell us a story of hope and trust in divine intervention. One is a symbol of idealization, of patiently suffering through illness and injury, the other of the triumphant victory obtained with the help of divine beings. But what both have in common, however, is that they give us an insight into how devotional culture has integrated stories and objects of the sick and the suffering. So that's what I'm interested in. So but why focus on devotions here? Why focus on devotions at all? When I look at the 19th and 20th centuries, there were different ways for Catholics to take care of their health and that of their family members. But the two most important ones were they could consult a doctor or another health expert, like a midwife, and they could pray to God and the saints to interfere. So these two options were available at the same time, which means that in scanning descriptions of one, you can often find information on the other. And I'm not the first one to point this out. In this respect, my work is similar to, for instance, that of Elisabeth Lobenwein, who studied Catholic birth miracles in the early modern era and showed that we can gather practical information from these miracle stories, for instance, about the presence of midwives at birth and the knowledge available at the time. Moreover, so the second reason why we should focus on devotions is because, in my opinion, focusing on devotional culture is an ideal means of getting access to the patients, or broader, the suffering and the sick. And in some cases, we can actually trace their voices, even though sometimes it's only through mediations of others, but sometimes it's really what they're writing, what they're saying. But the wonderful thing about Catholic devotional culture, and I cannot stress this enough, so that's why I'm saying it out here at the beginning, is that devotion has a very, very practical side to it. So people did things for specific reasons. So we can also study them by just focusing on what they did and the material and the visual remnants thereof, and examine what this tells us about their view on illness and injury, just like I did with kind of showing you the crutches just now. So before I start my story, I need to remind you that for Catholics of the 19th and 20th century, illness and injury had meaning. No one ever summarized it better than Robert Orsi did in 2004, when he stated, "Pain was always a thoughtful description of the divine physician." So as many scholars such as Roy Porter, Joanna Burke, Javier Moscoso, and recently Stephen Wilson have pointed out, disease and bodily pain has been interpreted, and here I'm quoting Stephen Wilson, in terms of its divine function, whether it be instruction, expiation, test, or even grace. And it's important to remember that it's not just an ideal, but that for the sick involved, these were not abstract ideals, but actually the ways in which they experience their body. So this is kind of something I would really, would want to start with. So given the extent and the diversity of Catholic devotional culture, I decided to focus primarily on the 1920s and 1930s in my presentation, even though I will be making comparisons with other eras, so before and after. But I narrate it down chronologically because this allows me to really dive into a few cases. I really want to give you an idea of the complexity of this type of thinking and its impact on the lives of individual Catholics. So I have two goals. First of all, I want to show how Catholic idealization of suffering as meaningful was not necessarily at odds with or excluded looking for medical and or divine help or a cure. So my use of hope here refers to hope for a cure and not the theological notion of hope for a reward in life after death. And with resignation, I refer to how suffering without complaining showed someone trust in God's plan. And I think I need to let you in on a little secret here, because initially I planned on dividing this presentation into one section on hope and one section on resignation, but that didn't work because they're actually constantly kind of present at the same time. So I think that's kind of very interesting already. So secondly, second goal is I want to show that in the era that I focus on, the medical is not perceived as in competition with the devotional for the faithful. It's more like a starting point. A documentation of medical treatment supports the case. It shows the severeness of the condition. It helps them build their case as a Catholic patient. But I will make comparisons with all the cases where you do see this competitive element. So that's something we will reflect on. again, I want to repeat, and in all of this, I will focus primarily on the views of the Catholic devotees, which means that that when I address miracles or saints, I include those miracles and saints that they believe to be true, like or genuine, not only the ones that the Church approved of. And I think it's an important differentiation to make. So in this first part, I will address how illness and injury were presented as part of salutary suffering, and how medical attempts to diminish pain, take care of an injury, or cure an illness could become part of hagiographic accounts. And in the second part, I study the moments Catholics looked for divine help at pilgrimage sites, and I look into how being ill, and thereby referring to medical testimonies, set Catholics apart as privileged pilgrims because of their suffering, but also because of their miracle potential. So let me start with 6 saints. In 1923, Maria van den Broek, a young woman from the Belgian village of Sinai, wrote at the request of a spiritual father, the Passionist Father Victor Clarisse, an autobiography of her illness, suffering, despair, and Holy Communion. Father Clarisse had explicitly asked her to include the exceptional gifts that Jesus had granted her, so Maria started with, well, the first and the greatest gift was my illness itself. Yes, Reverend Father, my illness, for dear Jesus alone knows what otherwise would have become of me. Since long, Jesus had pulled me to him in all his goodness. He had made me feel this in a very powerful way, and no, I would not have had the strength to listen to his calling voice. I would, in my internal weakness, see all the difficulties as unsurmountable obstacles. That is why my illness is the most special gift, through which Jesus, in his charitable kindness, secured me himself. So, Reverend Father, our dear Lord made me ill, because he wanted me for himself, and I would not have gotten there on my own. So these lines might startle the modern day readers. Why would you see illness as a gift? And Maria suffered severely, probably from TBC between 1910 and her death in 1928. And as this text fragment shows, she believed her illness, even though it included coughing up blood, fever, bed sores, and ulcers, allowed her to fully concentrate on Jesus. She longed to be sick, and on one occasion she asked her father confessor in a letter, "Allow me to ask Jesus not to leave a healthy spot on my body." So in this part, I want to explore this view on illness, of illness and injury, and more generally suffering as a gift, by examining the self-representation of Maria van den Broek and her German contemporary Anna Schäfer and their reception. So Maria van den Broek was one of the 9 surviving children of the clockmaker Alois van den Broek and Henriette Segers from Sinai-Waas in rural Flanders. She went to school in Sinai and late 1905 entered boarding school in nearby St. Niklaas until she was needed at home in August 1906 because of the illness of one of her sisters. At home, she helped in the household and the tailoring business of her sisters and took care of the books of her father's business. In 1910, she became ill, thought to be TBC, and was cured miraculously on Pentecost 1916, only to fall ill again 2 years later on Pentecost 1918. And she remained ill until her death on December 3rd, 1928. So Maria van den Broek had a religious calling, but could not enter the Passionist order due to health reasons, even though she did become a private member on the 31st of May, 1925. But whilst she could not enter the cloister, she did try to function as an apostle in the world. From her sickbed, she circulated religious books, collected donations for support of the priestly callings, and supported young girls who felt a religious calling. She allegedly experienced some supernatural phenomena, such as the miraculous cure that I mentioned, but also apparitions that started at the age of 7, first of her guardian angel, and later, when she was 8, of Jesus and Mary. And at 15, she also started to see the devil. Moreover, we also know that she participated in what we could describe as supernatural suffering. She took part in Christ's flagellation, for instance, on Good Friday 1915, to the extent that in the end, her whole body consisted solely of blood and wounds. Yet the day after, so the story went, the wounds were almost completely healed. But she also experienced Jesus crowning with the crown of thorns and the piercing of the heart. And she seems to have had a saintly reputation, for after her death, many visited her body, and she was with trust called upon as mediator. Anna Schäfer, on the other hand, was the 3rd of 8 children of Michael Schäfer, the carpenter of Mindelstädtel, and his wife, Therese Foster. The family had difficulties to make ends meet after the death of the father in 1896, and Anna Schäfer went to work as a servant. And on the 4th of February 1901, when she was working for the family of the forest superintendent in Stamham, she fell into a washing kettle full of boiling, soapy water. Her legs and arms were burned severely, and despite all medical treatment, she had more or less 30 operations in 2 years, she remained in need of care for the rest of her life. And after a few years, she became lame. She also suffered through an appendicitis, stomach ulcers, and she was diagnosed with intestinal cancer. And she insisted on making her own money through needlework and knitting, and also engaged in lay apostleship through letters, becoming an important spiritual counselor and consoler in her village and beyond. She participated in Christ's suffering. So again, you see this element of supernatural suffering. And on the 4th of October 1910, she received the stigmata, the wounds of Christ. She was a member of the Third Order of St. Francis and was buried in the dress of this order in 1925. Already during her lifetime, Anna Schäfer was idealized as a sacrificial soul and intercessor. And the devotion developed further after her death. She was beatified in 1999 and became a saint, so a real saint, on October 21st, 2012. So as you can see, the biographies of Anna Schäfer and Maria van den Broek show similarities. They're bedridden at a young age. They try to give a religious meaning to their sickbed, and both suffered through natural pain caused by illness or injury. And in both cases, supernatural suffering by participating in Christ's suffering amplified the pains they were going through. So it's important to note that the writings of both women have been preserved. Whilst I had access to the original writings of Maria van den Broek, I was not allowed to see the material of Anna Schäfer because of the canonization process. But many of her texts have been published, among which a manuscript that she herself gave the title Thoughts and Memories of My Life of Illness and My Longing for the Eternal Homeland. So this title already indicates or shows how Anna Schäfer put her identity as a sick person central in her writings. And as for Maria van den Broek's text, she actually wrote 2 autobiographies, as Father Clarisse was not happy with the first version, in which, because she did not address the exceptional gifts that Jesus had granted her enough. And we also have letters of Maria van den Broek to her sisters who entered the Passionist cloister. So given the emphasis that both women put on their pain, illness, and or injuries in their writings, I think we can rank the text, especially the longer ones, as pathographies. What Maria Rosa Loddo, and hereby she refers to Anna Hunsaker-Hauken's definition, describes as book-length narrative written by an ill person or someone close to him or her, describing a personal experience with infirmity, a pathological condition, or a disability. And she therefore reflects on the pathographies link with the tradition of spiritual autobiographies, and things that, well, Loddo states there, or believes that these books have conceived, and I quote here, illness as leading to a kind of self-knowledge that could not have been achieved through a painful, that could only be achieved through a painful apprenticeship with vulnerability. So illness is central kind of to the self-development here. So the beneficial effects of suffering were explicitly addressed by Maria van den Broek in her writings. She saw pain as a relief for this, or the physical pain as a relief for the suffering of the soul. And she writes at one point, if I did not have my corporeal miseries, I would not know what I would do. These poor pains now ease the suffering of my soul. Pain cleansed her soul, but was also beneficial for others. And so she writes, and in this way, our poor suffering becomes a balm for the wounds that the ingratitude of people continuously inflicts upon the heart of the divine bridegroom. So here you can already see how her view on suffering was linked to the devotion of the suffering Christ. And by participating in his suffering, she believed that she could ease Christ's suffering. And that kind of reasoning also made her and a friend of hers at barely 11 years old decide that they wanted to sacrifice themselves, and they took turns in getting sick. So this sacrificing herself for Christ is also a recurring theme in Anna Schäfer's writing. She sacrificed herself as a reparatory victim, Sühneopfer, on the day of her Holy Communion for all the dishonor and the insults committed against Jesus. She believed that God wanted her to suffer for the sins of others and attempted to save as many souls as she could. She saw her life as a small martyrdom and carefully planned a prayer schedule of atonement hours, during which she prayed either for a personal or for a general cause. And with this beneficial effect of suffering in mind, she wrote, "Dear God, I thank you for each hour of suffering." So both women clearly believed in the salvific nature of their suffering, and as such, their voluntary suffering fits the ideal of the heroic victim and the vicarious suffering that has been so wonderfully described by Paula Kane, and I believe she's in the audience there, so I think that's kind of that's the seminal text. If you ever want to read anything, read Paula's work. They were amongst the women who patiently accepted and suffered through pain and hardships that God had been willing to send them. So these could be supernatural, like the stigmata or participation in Christ's flagellation, but also included illnesses and injuries. They carried the hardships willingly in the belief that it was God's will and their pain had meaning. Through their pain, they could atone for the sins of others. And apart from their own illnesses and afflictions, reparatory suffering could be self-inflicted and include corporeal ascetic practices like fasting and self-mutilation. And here I think, so first I want to show you the devices that Maria van den Broek actually created herself. So those are the top ones. Because she kind of, when she was still healthy, she actively sought out pain. And I think it's important, and so she flagellated herself and she wore cilices. But in this respect, she's somewhat different to Anna Schäfer. So it's quite interesting to see, like, even though these women have like similar feelings about what suffering is and how you should accept the suffering that God sends you, Maria van den Broek seems to have like a slightly different view on that, since she actually actively looks or tries to increase the suffering. So Anna Schäfer and Maria van den Broek resembled many other women of their time, also called Dülmen. So the German word it kind of refers to the patient sufferer, or the French crutch, which kind of stresses the bedridden factor of these women. And they also seem to have been well familiar with mystical sufferers like Gemma Galgani and Maddalena de Pazzi, whom they refer to in their writings. So still, and I cannot stress this enough, whilst Anna Schäfer and Maria van den Broek took the Via Dolorosa and experienced suffering as religiously meaningful, this did not mean that there were no attempts to diminish their pain. On the contrary, so how did these attempts to heal their afflictions fit into this narrative of idealization of suffering, and something you should accept? How can we link these attempts to be healed with an idealization of suffering? And in this women's writing, the interesting thing is that it seems that the cure or the healing methods become part of the pain description, part of the suffering. So Anna Schäfer wrote her memories of her life as a patient, but also included references to her treatment in her religious poems. And I think the following poem of August 1919 gives a very good impression of how easily she linked her being a patient, or merged her being a patient with her religious ideas. And she called it the Illness and Surgery poem. And I'm going to apologize because I'm going to read it in German, because I think it sounds better in German, but I try to make a translation so you can easily follow. But I think just to give it a respect she deserves, I'll read it out loud. So, Krankheits- und Operationsgedicht. Mich auf dem Operationstisch hinzulegen, dazu gehört wohl Mut. An diesem dürfte ich 30 Mal dort opfern, Schmerz und Blut. Nochmals dachte ich an meine Lieben und sagte alle, lebe wohl. Dann noch ein Blick zum Kreuzesdolder, aus dessen Wunden heil wirkt wohl. Ihm wollte ich stets mein Leben schenken, auch für ihn sterben in dieser Stund. Das waren meine letzten Worte, das wünschte ich mit Herz und Mund. Als dann das Chloroform mir erreichte, so widerlich erstickend süß, da hat sich jeder Nerv gestärkt, bis das Bewusstsein mich verließ. Bleischwer lag ich in meinen Gliedern, im Kopfe Kreuz wie Donner mir, und konnte mich nicht mehr befassen, was weiter dann geschah mit mir. Und sollte ich das Erwachen schildern, so finde ich die Worte nicht, denn niemand kann es ja begreifen, wenn man nicht selber hat gefühlt. Lang lag ich da noch fantasierend, gab alles kund, was mir am Herzen lag, bis dass der Wundschmerz ach, so brennend, mir das Bewusstsein wieder gab. So as you can see, Anna Schäfer explicitly addresses the pain she feels after the operation, the nausea the chloroform caused, and how she had to say goodbye to her family, and combines that with references to her willingness to sacrifice herself for Jesus, and how she was inspired by his suffering. So the wonderful thing about the cases of these two women is that we not only have the writings of Anna Schäfer and Maria van den Broek, but we also have the biographies. So we can also see what elements have been singled out in their descriptions. And it's, for instance, interesting to note that Anna Schäfer has been held out as an example in various of her biographies, because the first one was already published a few years after her death by Friedrich Ritter von Lama in 1930, and he called her an example of our time. And one of the recent books on Schäfer similarly calls her an example for the sick, for the suffering, and for the poor. And that biography was published in 2012, so you see there's kind of continuation there. And this emphasis on Anna Schäfer's role as an example for the injured and the sick is something we see also in one of the most successful biographies of her, written by Konrad Zoller and published in 1949, called The Life and the Suffering. Life and the Suffering of the Maiden Anna Schäfer from Minderstadt, a pilgrimage. So here you can see the title page, or the cover, I'm sorry. So interestingly, when we look at Zollber's work, he emphasizes, of course, Anna Schäfer's pain, but he didn't want to present her pain as unique. So because, of course, the time in which he was writing in 1949, so war had just ended, and for at the time that he was writing, numerous contemporaries were actually going through similar things, and reflecting on why people came to pray at their grave. Zoller noted, "Are they coming to you because your suffering was an exceptional one? They will certainly expect from someone who has suffered like you, understanding and heart for someone else's suffering, but we cannot call your suffering exceptional. Only this: how big will the number of your male and female followers suffer be, who were in the war hopelessly mutilated, or after being burned and scalded in a fire attack, lay helpless and linger hopelessly." So her suffering is not that exceptional, but she's exceptional in another way, according to Zoller. But the way in which you carried your heavy suffering was exceptional, exemplary, appealing, and confidence-inspiring. So what made her exceptional, in his opinion, was her way of dealing with it, of accepting her pain and voluntarily resigning to God's will. So interestingly, in this depiction, the ways in which Anna Schäfer's wound were treated, in fact, also contributed to her suffering. He described the medical treatment in the smallest detail, and it's kind of gruesome if you read it, cutting out the full flesh, scraping up the bones, skin transfers from your body, or your own body, or from the arms of your brother Michael and your sister Katharina, ointments, acid-holding alumina, alum, 2 years long. 30 operations with weak narcosis. And finally, the doctors fed the feet with styrofoam gauze that had to be renewed every 5 days for 22 years. The last time on the day of your death. And when the gauze touches the open flesh, it burns for 3 days like pepper, you said. And after that, the pus already starts to burn again. So with this detailed description of Anna Schäfer's treatment, he not only illustrated how this treatment in fact amplified her suffering, but also how she longed for a cure and was willing to try everything. And it's important to stress that here. He explicitly noticed this. Yes, willingness to suffer, he says, yet not a sublimation of suffering. From start to end, you sensibly tried all natural means, physicians and pharmacies, to the extent to which they could help you regain your health, or at least alleviate your diseases. If you had been born in the forecourt of the life of resurrection, where the Son of Man wandered through the promised land and healed all, if he had given you his hand and said, "Anna, rise and be healthy," you would have happily held out your hand. So in this emphasis on Anna Schäfer not seeking pain, Schäfer's profile becomes somewhat different from the self-description of Maria van den Broek, who, as I said already, was, when she was still healthy, flagellating herself to resemble Christ. She wore a cleat between the ages of 15 and 18, and she damaged her own health. So as a kind of a short conclusion to this first part, both Anna Schäfer and Maria van den Broek gave religious meaning to their suffering. In their writings, their illness and injury held a central place, and they themselves built their identities around them. So remember that Schäfer's book was called Thoughts and Memories of My Life of Illness, and that Van den Broek called her illness the greatest gift that Jesus gave her. In the eyes of the biographies of both women, Anna Schäfer and Maria van den Broek both fit the idea of the heroic victim, and they were held out as examples. And in spite of this idealization of suffering at the time, this did not eclipse the attempts to try and remedy illnesses and injuries. And in fact, the accounts of these treatments could make the case of the suffering would-be saint even stronger, as they showed the severeness of the condition and the extra pains they needed to go through in an attempt to get better. So resignation here meant trusting God's will. He wanted them to be sick, and they could help others by atoning for their sins via their own suffering. But the idealization of suffering had its limits, and if a cure had been available, then Anna Schäfer, according to a biographer, believed would have taken it. So this brings me to part 2, sick pilgrims. So, and I want to start here with kind of the question that I think is a logical result of this first part. So if suffering and illness is meaningful, is it then okay to hope for a cure? The answer is complex. So, and to address this question, I would like to focus in the following part on pilgrimage sites like Åsaker, since they belong to the sites where the sick are singled out as a separate group, and the popularity of the site is closely linked to the possibility of healing the thaumaturgical power of the site. So before I dive into my cases, I would like to summarize the work that both Andrea Dahlberg and Robert Oschi have done on this. So first of all, in our anthropological study of Lourdes pilgrimages published in 1991, Andrea Dahlberg studied pilgrimage groups that traveled to the Pyrenean shrine and detected 2 ways of thinking about these trips. So there was a miracle discourse and a sacrifice discourse. So whilst some pilgrims traveled to Lourdes in pursuit of a divine favor, other pilgrims, together with the staff of the shrine, stressed that a pilgrimage was a sacrifice. So pilgrims looking for a cure or an amelioration of their suffering were constantly, and here I'm quoting, were constantly reminded of the superiority of the soul over the body, as well of the spiritual benefits conferred to bodily suffering. So kind of there's a hierarchy here. And Robert Orsi addressed similar issues in the study of the ethos of pain amongst American Catholics of mid-20th century. An ethos of pain that demanded the sick to be cheerful and not complain, to see their illness as an opportunity for spiritual growth. And here I'm quoting again, but it was the romance of pain itself that made it complicated for Catholics to hope for healings of any sort. To seek relief was understandable perhaps, but still an instance of human selfishness, a denial of the soul's superiority to the body, and a rejection of the opportunity for saintliness. So in both these studies on Catholicism of the second half of the 20th century then, seeking a cure was frowned upon as missing an opportunity for sanctification. So this emphasis on sacrifice is definitely also something we see in pilgrimage literature of the 19th and early 20th century, but it's not the only narrative I can trace. So when we study a booklet on the Åsaker site, so again, I'm returning to the original site where I started. So published in 1875, for instance. So when you look at that, it seems to suggest a different order. It's okay to try for a miracle, but if that does not happen, the sick pilgrim needs to show resignation. So God had indeed given his saints the capacity to heal specific ailments or illnesses, and Mary in particular was very successful as the salvation of the sick, but sometimes it was not part of God's plan for the person to be healed. And Emil Scherlik, who was the author of the booklet, described how pilgrims at times pray for a cure and are not heard. And then he says, and even then one dares to exclaim, dispirited and with bitter regret on the lips, I have not been heard or healed. Our faint-hearted Christian, know that suffering is completely in line with God's inscrutable views. Corporeal illnesses and ailments are often useful, yes, even completely necessary for salvation. They detach us from the earth, fill us with a sense of man's significance, and braid us an imperishable crown that will later wrap our cleansed forehead in heaven. So with eyes on the reward in heaven, the faithful should suffer through whatever God sends on their way. But there were exceptions indeed, and The crutches and the ex-photos, here I'm quoting again, that you can see hanging from the blessed rock have to strengthen your faith and trust, but should not make you forget the endless benefits that Mary gives to the souls. If you pray to Mary and the complete healing does not follow, still the good mother will ease those torments, put balm of consolation on the suffering heart, and give it the necessary strength to suffer through the length of the ordeal with resignation. The element of resignation again. So there are different ways in which we could explain a slightly different emphasis. First of all was a new pilgrimage site at the time that still needed to kind of establish its reputation, and publications promoting the site would stress its thaumaturgical potential. And in this regard, it's interesting to note that the cure of Pierre de Rudder, one of the most famous miracles of Lourdes, Oostsakker is actually kind of an imitation site of Lourdes, so it kind of fits, but its most famous miracle of Oostsakker is actually depicted above the entrance of the church at Oostsakker. So a second reason why there would be so much emphasis on the miracle is also because this is the era of the culture wars. We're talking about the 1870s. So each attested, documented, and examined miracle could be used as an argument for God's continuing presence on earth. It had a kind of also a role beyond kind of the sphere of the apparition side. So in these 19th century miracle stories, which that the booklet narrates, medical experts played a supporting and a contesting role. In his introduction of the list of miracles or miraculous cures reported at the site, Emil Schierling took great care to include as many medical reports as he could, indicating the importance he attached to the medical expertise. Yet he also mentioned that, here I'm quoting, "The man of this art, whose testimony we asked, lacked courage and goodwill." So here you can really see, like, yeah, you really need to kind of be courageous if you want to kind of testify for a miracle to happen. And some Sikhs seem to have had this thought of, or have seen the relationship between medicine and religion in similar competitive terms. And here I'm referring to a story the miracle story of Josefina Böck, who was cured on March 22nd, 1874. And she sought medical help after losing her speech. And after that, after trying to get medical support, she was subjected to the most painful cures, I'm citing here, including blister-inducing patches and electricity, but to no avail. So Josefina Böck decided to call upon Mary's support and started a novena. And during this last novena, the doctor wanted to put a new patch on the afflicted part, but Josefina, and he was citing, she protested and stating like that testing human beings in this stage could suggest a distrust regarding Mary's support. Medicine might want to hinder a supernatural cure. So the first supernatural event took place at that moment, according to Emil Schierling, for in spite of the patient's protests, the doctor tried to adhere this patch to the afflicted part, but it did not stick. And here Schierling comments, Mary wanted to show from that moment on that she was responsible for Josefina's upcoming cure. So here you can clearly see it's kind of a it's medicine against religion, and I think this. For most people in the audience, that kind of rings a bell. It makes us think about work that has already been done on the medicalization of the miracle, the Catholic Church call for medical expertise in the evaluation of miracles in canonization processes and at apparition sites. And I'm thinking, for instance, of the work that has been done on the medical bureau in Lourdes by Jason Sabo, Susanna Kaufman, Ruth Harris, and of course the keynote of yesterday evening, Anne Harrington. So drawing on upon an expert report made the story of a cure more convincing and provided more dramatic narrative. And I think the easiest way to summarize the miracle narratives in this 19th century Oostsakker booklet is divine intervention trumps medical expertise. But what if you don't focus on the miracles, stories with a good outcome? What if you shift your focus to the sick that remain sick or were not yet cured? What role did medicine play in their stories of hope and resignation? So in this last part of the presentation, I want to look into two Belgian Marian apparition shrines that started in the 1930s. So given the fact that they were in the initial phase of their development, you would expect an emphasis on miraculous cures, so to establish the thaumaturgic reputation. And I do indeed have those miracle stories, but I do not want to focus solely on these. I want to look at different moments when the sick presented themselves as sick at the sites and were treated as a separate set of pilgrims. So not just, I do not just want to focus on the stories with happy outcome. And I want to examine how the promoter of the site dealt with sick pilgrims, their miracle potential, and the cures that were reported. Were they as critical as the late 20th century Lourdes pilgrims who tried to temper the hope for the cure? So first of all, the sick as a separate category of pilgrims. I think a good way to see how the sick received a special treatment at these sites is to look at the mass pilgrimage that took place on the 5th of August 1933. Tilman Combe, who was one of the visionaries of Beaurain, had announced that the Virgin would appear on that day. So many expected a miracle to happen, and in order for them to be close to the visionary that day, the sick were given a special place close to the apparition site. So in order to gain entrance to this special place, they actually needed to get their name on a list. So they actually needed to prove that they were sick. So the archives of the sanctuary still hold the files of that event. And whilst we have some of them writing on their own accounts, so some of the sick are writing, I'm actually sick, so please give me entrance. We also see how others are voting for them. So these files does include, as you might expect, doctors, but also their pastor and the local police officer. So one of them, for instance, read, I, undersigned police commissioner of Drogenbos, confirmed that the name G, Pauline, and her sister Julia, both residents of Drogenbos, are blind and crippled since several years. Police Commissioner Isowitz in charge of the population. And another one was written by Dr. van der Putte from Ghent, who informed the organizers about the health of aged Cecile, 14 years, from Ghent, who is afflicted by chronic encephalopathy that dates back to the first months of her life, that thereafter resulted in idiocy, and the child did not learn how to speak, nor to comprehend its environment. Its condition has remained statutory since several years. So I think the interesting thing here is that it's clearly not just up to the doctors to decide who is sick. Others could vouch for them as well, which is a nice illustration of how being ill or injured is often a social event. The whole community was involved. So also after the apparitions ended, the sick were set apart as a separate category of pilgrims at the pilgrimage site. So the practices that developed at these sites and the pilgrimage that the faithful organized did not seldom include versions that were tailored to the need of the sick. Banu developed at a much quicker pace than Beaurain did, and already 6 weeks after the apparitions, the non-profit organization Pèlerinage de Banu published its statutes in the official government gazette. They wanted to organize pilgrimages and take care of the sick who came to Banu. There were special pilgrimages for the sick and separate shelters for them, and baths were installed at the pilgrimage site. And in this respect, the developments in Banu were quite similar to those in Lourdes, and this is definitely not a coincidence because many of the Banu promoters had actually experience in organizing and supervising pilgrimages to Lourdes. So you see how the knowledge kind of travels back to Belgium here. So originally, the sick were submerged in the water of Banu in these baths. So, but after a few years, the practice diminished to just being sprinkled with the water or submerging the afflicted part in the water was praying an act of penitence together with the nurse. And the practice was eventually abandoned after circa 1970. So here, I think it's a very nice example of how devotional practices change over the years as well. So, and that's definitely also something we need to kind of take into account when we're studying this. So the ill and the injured very quickly found their way to Banu and Beaurain. Already a few days after the end of the apparitions, a first miraculous cure was said to have taken place in Banu when Agnes Boutet from Louvigny, who had been paralyzed for 15 years, was said to have limped to 2 kilometers to Banu. So after he had taken some water from the source and said a prayer, he was cured. And in March 1933, 25 cures had already been reported. So the cures seem to have been a very important element in kind of development of the popular enthusiasm for the site. So the hope for a miraculous cure is visible in different religious practices that developed at the site. So the prayers, burning candles, but it's also visible, or these religious practices also developed at home. And we have traces of that. So for the archives of both sanctuaries contain letters of the faithful who seem to hope for what André Vaucher has called a miracle at a distance, and what Gabriela Signori sees as a kind of a Veralltäglichung, even a banalization of the miracle, turning it into just one of the therapeutic practices amongst the many. The miracle lost its spectacular quality. So we see the sick, and here you can see a letter, we see the sick asking for a bottle with water from the Banu source or a leaf of the apparition tree in Borin, because they ascribed thaumaturgical powers to these elements. Both water and the leaves were used in improvised remedies. The leaves were eaten, they were drunk as tea, or they were turned into a potion and put on the afflicted part. And in these letters, again, the sick described themselves explicitly as sick, or the family members described them as sick to kind of get their hands on this type of material. And we know from the periodicals published by the promoters of the site how big the request was. So in Borin in November 1933, so circa a year after the apparitions, the promoters of the site warned the readers that the pieces of the tree would only be obtained via them or the sisters of the Christian doctrine who owned the garden in which the apparitions had taken place, and that they were free of charge. So the reader should not pay attention to the salespeople who claimed to sell pieces of the tree and asked a lot of money for them. And some months later, in an article of February 1934, the committee indicated that they had received no less than 500 requests in the week of January 28 to February 3rd. So their storage was almost completely emptied, and they wanted to stress that only those who were really, really in need could contact them and ask the others to wait just a little while longer. And similarly, in Banu, the Caritas organization that was in charge of the site claimed in 1937 that they had already distributed 20,000 bottles of Banu water. So it's quite difficult to check statements like these, but we know from the numerous testimonies in l'Officiel de Borin that the faithful were indeed asking for such fragments and that they ascribed miraculous cures to them. These reports of miraculous cures in periodicals were following the reciprocity principle, and that's actually basically what it comes down to is you received a favor from Mary, so in response you need to show that you're grateful, you need to show kind of how powerful she is, so you need to announce it to the world, and you could do that via ex votos. But in this era you could also kind of publish your small piece, your story in the periodicals to a wider audience, of course. So that's kind of a way of making yourself visible as a grateful miraculé. And the promoters of the site seem to have been happy to include these stories in their periodicals and even create an occasional overview of them. You can see one on the slide. Yeah, there were also, when you look at kind of what we're producing, so on the one hand, they were including these references to the miraculous cures in their periodicals, but they also allowed ex votos on the side. And here you see the small chapel that was created in Banu. It's filled with ex votos. So the cures helped to play or played an important role in establishing the credibility of the site, since they were part of the examination of the site by the diocesan authorities. So on the one hand, so you have the whole list of miracles that have been reported, and then it's narrowed down. So this is what I'm addressing here. We know that some of these miraculous cures were examined by a medical commission created in December 1933. And it was the Society of St. Luke that was assigned a task to do that, to examine the apparitions at different sites in Belgium. That was the first job. And the second job was to study the miraculous cures that were reported at various sites. And if the commission members could not find an explanation, then the phenomena would be subjected to a theological examination. And the report they submitted on November 4th, 1934, it reflected on the cures in Borin and noted that the number of the cures reported as a result of prayer, novena, or pilgrimage to Borin was quite large. So there were too many. So this forced the commission members to make a selection. And to obtain the most interesting cases, they had to consult the files of Dr. Mastriot, who was the local physician. And with his approval, they had drawn up a list of about 10 cases and contacted the doctors involved. And in their judgment, none of the cases was convincing. After a short factual description of the person of interest, the affliction, the doctor involved, or the doctors they asked to perform an examination when no doctor had been involved, And the cure, the report summarized the reasons for not selecting the cures as sufficiently proof of supernatural interventions, as you can see at the slide. So here you have the selected cures of Borin and Banneux. And they also added a general conclusion. Here I'm reading the one for Borin. So for each of them, to the extent that they were able to gather sufficient information, we have developed commentaries and conclusions. And for certain cases, we were able to establish a diagnosis and prove that the cure involved nothing so extraordinary. For other cases, because of a lack of precise information, we could only make some hypotheses. In none of the cases were we under the impression that we were in the presence of phenomena that were inexplicable to science. And the results were similar for those in Banneux. The commission findings on the Banneux case seem to have been similar. Either there was too little information for scientific conclusion, or a natural explanations still remained possible. So it's not the cases are not strong enough. But in spite of this initial rather negative evaluation of the cures at the two apparition site, two cures would play a major role in the evaluation of the events in Borin by the Second Diocesan Commission of Namur in spring of 1949. So here maybe I can notice that the ways in which Marian apparitions are evaluated can differ according to the diocese that you're studying. And in the case of Namur, where Borin is listed, or what is the diocese of Borin, they decided they also wanted to look at the miraculous cures. And in this case, the cure of Madame Accard and Maria van Laar, who later became the Sister Prudentia of the Franciscan Sisters of the Holy Family, were deemed convincing. And in his public statement on the two cures, the Bishop of Namur stressed the value and the authority of the experts involved. And because of them, because of the involvement of these experts, it was safe to say that the women in question, and here I'm quoting, had suffered from afflictions of an extreme gravity, and that they had been healed suddenly, perfectly, and definitely, and without a natural healing agent that could have explained the changes. So before I move on to the general conclusion, I would like to point out two things. So first of all, Catholic devotees presented themselves as sick in order to get a better access to the site and obtain relics. And secondly, for the young apparition sites of Borin and Banneux, miraculous cures seem to have been welcome. They made a good promotional material and helped to convince commissions of the credibility of the case. But there is a difference in miracles, the ones that the faithful saw as miracles and the ones that were officially approved. And I think that if we want to study the faithful and their perceptions, we need to pay more attention to the first ones, so not just focus on the official ones. Some concluding remarks. I hope I've given you in this presentation some information on how Catholics of the early 20th century looked at being sick and being cured. And first of all, I hope that by not focusing solely on miracle stories, I've shown that the triumphant story of the cure, the divine intervention trumping medical expertise, is only one way, one of the many ways in which Catholics brought medical into their devotional life. And here we've seen how medical treatment featured in hagiographic accounts, and how the sick sometimes needed to prove that they were indeed ill and referred to medical reports. Neither of these holds an element of competition, but shows how easy it was for them to bank on two options, the medical and the divine, when hoping for a cure or at least an easing of their suffering. And in this respect, it might be of interest to note that the differentiation that Andrea Delberg made between the discourse of miracle and the discourse of sacrifice was not useful for me, because I've kind of played around with that. But it did not work because for the Catholics that I studied, they did not just expect help from divine beings. They were also looking for kind of medical help. Secondly, while the cases I studied today indeed confirm the idealization of suffering and the special status of the sick in Catholic devotional culture, with illness and suffering being an opportunity for spiritual growth or atoning for the sins of others. We see the hope for a cure in the imitation of, or what we saw in the opening picture, the imitation body, limbs, the crutches and other exvotus left at the pilgrimage site. We see this hope for a cure in the call upon medical help in cases of extreme suffering, and in the letters asking for some water or a piece of the apparition tree. So Catholics presented themselves as sick, or within this context of the idealization of suffering. So think about Anna Schäfer's manuscript with putting her life of illness kind of central, and Maria van den Broek's autobiographical text. But also, they also formulated the hope of being cured in letters in the very devotional objects. And we've seen laudatory receptions of both. Still, I think we need to stress here that even within the cases idealizing suffering, there seems to be a difference in the ways in which, for instance, Schäfer and van den Broek evaluated accepting suffering and actively seeking it out. So even though you have this general idea, the ways in which individual Catholics played with this idea of suffering, it kind of differed from case to case. Furthermore, there seems to have been a change in Catholic devotional culture concerning the emphasis on the miraculous cures. As I said, I focused primarily on the 1920s and 1930s, but I was kind of puzzled to see what happened in the 1990s and the mid-20th century. And I was wondering, like, would that be happening to my cases as well? So I kind of, I looked a little farther, and I think kind of the negative response, or kind of the cautious response, maybe I should say, what Andrea Dahlberg could see in her study of the pilgrimages to Lourdes is also something that you can see in the work of Katrien Noordermans and Willy Janssen, who addressed ex votos in Lourdes. And they described it as contested materiality of miraculous healing. So something that kind of the people present at the shrine it becomes more and more problematic, so kind of removing it. So here you can see also how a kind of this display of the miraculous becomes a little more problematic. So that seems to kind of point at the same trend. And in the cases that I studied, all crutches and evoke ex votos have been removed. And in the new periodical on Banu, La Vierge des Pauvres, which was kind of created in 1955, emphasis in the issues of 1950s and 1970s that I scanned seem to have been more, or have been on illness and suffering, with the sick presented as powerful and at the center of the church. And I would like to end here with kind of an article published in La Vierge des Pauvres of 1957. And here it reflects on pilgrimage as an act of hope. And I kind of like the fact that it's kind of combined here, because what the author is referring to is not my type of hope, so the hope for a cure, but actually what he says is maybe the only miracle we should expect or could expect at the site was of a different, of a more soul-oriented nature. So actually the big miracle should be kind of the kind of the acceptance at the site, kind of growing spiritually. So with this, I kind of indicating that there's a whole new story to be told about the other decades. I would like to end here. Thank you.